y'all. It's fireside chat time. So, this topic feels pretty relevant to this current moment, but I will say that Christina and I first decided that we should do this service on this Sunday in May. So, we had sort of opened with the question of, and want to start with the question of, why this topic, right? The question of what are our pathways to consider ourselves police and prison abolitionists, why does that feel urgent right now? And there's ways that this week makes it feel really urgent or sort of suddenly topical. But for me, it's the tension between what is lawful and what is right and how those are not the same thing. For me was really lifted up. Part of why I asked Christina, I was like, I think we need to have this conversation really explicitly at the fellowship, is that after last spring's No Kings rally, a lot of you came up to me and expressed your sort of gratitude and delight and just a real sense that wasn't that a great lawful gathering? Wasn't it great to see everyone law-abiding and peaceful, and isn't that what we should aspire to? And I was like, I'm not saying that I aspire for it to have been out of control, but something caught inside of me, because I think from that point of view in time, I felt okay, but what aligns with our values and what is considered legal are currently not the same thing all the time, and will just continue. Those two definitions are just going to get further and further apart as this administration wears on. It's just going to get more and more that what we consider right and in line with our values is considered unlawful. And that I wanted to make sure we were having this conversation explicitly together, as a way to kind of ground ourselves for this moment. Do you want to?
Yeah. I think the tension between what is lawful and what is right, as well as the, and we're going to talk about it again in a moment, but the unlearning of things that we thought we knew, because that also arose last year when we were doing Know Your Rights trainings around immigration and what happens if ICE shows up and those kinds of things. And some of the participants sort of expressed surprise and concern of I'm not used to feeling like police can't be trusted. Because we were saying, the difference in the warrants, we need to look at the warrants and those kinds of things. And that's, obviously there are people among us whose privilege is less, who have felt for a long, long, long time that police are not to be trusted. But there are others among us that are new to that feeling. So
yeah, well, and I think that's the right segue into the first question that I think that we wanted to lift up, which is how did personal and familial relationships shape your relationship to policing in prisons?
Well, okay, so for me, I mentioned this last week, my paternal grandfather was a warden. He was a prison warden. And he was a good man. He loved his children, and he would occasionally, the young people in his prison would be released and have nowhere to go, and he would bring them home, things like that. He alone was not a bad person. But that was part of my family story. Two of my uncles worked in corrections, and my father was in the military. And I was taught to respect authority, to stand and put your hand over your heart when the pledge and the Star-Spangled Banner play. And so I didn't think much about prisons or policing. It just wasn't part of my upbringing until I was a young adult. And I was an intern minister in Annapolis, Maryland. And there was a man there, a volunteer, who had a prison ministry where he would teach emotional literacy to inmates in a local medium security men's prison. And he asked me if I wanted to come along and, go to this ministry. And I was like, sure, I'm an intern, good learning. So I jumped through all the hoops, filled out all the forms to be a volunteer. And we went, and there were some other volunteers there. And the next morning, he emailed everyone and said, okay, I'm going to Florida. Christina will continue the program. So I did, and then I actually created some systems to make it more of a church program and not just these random volunteers. And so when I came back a year later, after finishing seminary, the prison ministry was still going, so I got involved. Eventually my then boyfriend, who later became my husband, got involved in the program. So for years and years, every week I went into a men's medium security prison and got to know these people. There was one guy, and every week I would say to him, hey, it's good to see you. And he would say, it's good to be seen. And I realized that that is part of the system of policing and prisons in particular, is that they're designed to not be seen. They're designed to hide people away, so that we can only be left with our assumptions about who they are. They must have done something terrible, therefore they must be terrible, therefore they deserve to be there. And it's hard to do that assumption making when you actually know people. And so for me, that was one of the big shifts. And I can say more about my family and stuff too, but we'll keep going from there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it was fascinating when we were talking about this. I was like, oh, I have a family that was on the other side of the prison door than yours, Christina. So I have multiple cousins who have served time in state and federal prison for things related to addiction and its various accompanying sort of criminalizations. And so that was just like a feature of my childhood, to understand that these people who I knew and were in prison. I think my mom still has a mug that her cousin who was incarcerated made for my brother and I and sent to us when he was inside. And so it was just like, it was there in my childhood. And I would also say that, so I grew up in Racine, which is a place where questions about violence and policing and drugs were just like very front of mind, in a way that I do not experience them as being here in Appleton. And then I would also say that as I sort of aged, I had more and more, friends and people I cared about deeply who had interactions with law enforcement where they were not treated with respect. I think, I just want to name, I think particularly for people who are socialized and raised as women, that we often have other friends who identify as women or femmes who have reported sexual assault to law enforcement and had an experience that's somewhere between unhelpful and deeply re-traumatizing. Right? I think that's actually a fairly common experience. And so for me, it just kept bringing up this question of if they're not here for this, if they're not here to help, then what is it? Then what is the purpose? And I will say I also taught in the prison ministry program that Christina designed. And it's that changing, and that just really shaped my sense of mistrust. And I'll talk about it a little more lately, but I think I grew up and grew into, based on just a collection of interactions over time, just a deep sense of you never know what you're gonna get when you involve law enforcement in trying to solve a problem. And that was just the reality I feel that I sort of grew up surrounded by. Yeah, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, so Our next question has to do with our Wonder Box. How has unlearning been central to your journey toward becoming an abolitionist?
Yeah. I think like, from that, part of what my unlearning was the question of, like, what is safety? Like, what does safety really mean? And what does it really feel like? And what are the structures that will actually create the conditions of safety in our communities? Which then, the underlying question for me is also the question of, like, who or what is considered most valuable or most worth protecting under the sort of, like, current dominant systems of policing. And so I lived in Baltimore, Maryland, for 6 years as a young adult, including in 2015 when Freddie Gray died in police custody, and there was deep unrest and hurt and just like trauma spilling into the streets about what had happened. And I think one of the pieces that lifted up for me was that, experiencing that is that there was a lot of unrest in the community and potential harm, and there was just this enormous need, but that what the resources like the National Guard were deployed to do was primarily to sort of protect property. And I remember we were biking home one night right before curfew and just seeing National Guard, members of the National Guard sort of like guarding my local CVS. Because they didn't want it to be looted for narcotics. And so, but it's that deep feeling of like, there is such enormous need in this community, and like, here is how these resources are being deployed. And is this really the most imaginative, most responsive, most community-oriented way we are spending just like gobs of money to support the city? And it just wasn't. And I think that for me really was the moment of feeling like there needs to be something to construct. Because like I said, I had spent most of my adolescence and young adulthood feeling like something between ambivalence and mistrust of law enforcement, but that was the moment for me where it moved from just sort of a like, man, I don't like those guys, into this sense of like, oh no, it's not just that. It's not just a sense of like, I am opposed to this system. It is a sense of like, I want to construct something. That it's not just an angry position, but in fact an imaginative one, where it's like, I want to imagine a way we use these resources differently in our communities, rather than just like, I am opposed to the existing system. And I feel like for me, that is what has made the work feel like generative and sustainable and life-giving, rather than sort of a source of just like conflict and anger over the course of my life. What about you? How has unlearning been central to your journey?
I mean, I had to unlearn a lot. I was raised and socialized as a middle-class white woman. And I remember in seminary as a young adult going on a road trip with my then boyfriend, and we got pulled over on a highway in southern Illinois in like a speed trap. And he came over to give us the ticket, and I was like, we weren't speeding. We absolutely weren't speeding. But he's like, okay, well, the officer up there on the overpass clocked you, so you're gonna have to take it up with him. So he hands me the ticket. I come around, and that officer says, there's nothing I can do about it. He gave you the ticket. And I lost it. And I was like, this is Nazi behavior. It's not, I don't have any responsibility. They don't have any responsibility. I just doing what I'm told. And I was yelling at this officer. And I now look at that and realize the incredible amount of privilege that I had in acting that way. Now, I don't think I was wrong, but I had to, first of all, unlearn that the officers were going to do what was just. That was a very small example of an injustice. But also unlearn my position in society, In 2015, I was also living in the Baltimore, D.C. area, and we were in the process of adopting a baby. We had already gone through the home study and all of that, and the agency we were working with the primary population of children that they placed for adoption were children of color, just because of the demographics of the area. And so they were very clear that parents were not to go through that agency if we were not willing and able to parent children of color. So we had to go through lots and lots of training, which is actually not the case in most transracial adoption, which I didn't know at the time. But we went through some really, really rigorous training. And then Freddie Gray was murdered in police custody. And I could only imagine Freddie as my future child. And then in December of that year, we got our first child, who is a person of color. And I have had to learn what it means to parent a child of color, to talk to him from a very young age about safety, about how to work with police, about how to keep himself safe first and foremost, in a way that my parents never had to talk to me. I've had to learn that and also unlearn what I thought was true in order to be the parent I need to be for him and for his brother. So that's deeply personal, but it's also just yet another sign of my privilege and the system not working really the way we want it to for any of us, but also explicitly not working for certain populations.
Yeah, and so knowing that this is this is both a tender and expansive topic, and we could go and go and go, but I want to close us with the question, what about abolition are you holding most closely in this moment, right? Recognizing that this is both something, as is clear from the sort of broad ground we've tread and this current moment we're in, it's both something that's slow burning and so front of mind. So in this moment, what are you holding most closely about abolition right now, Christina?
I am holding that human beings have inherent worth and dignity, and that they don't belong in cages. I don't care what they did. And so recognizing that the humanity of every single person in the system needs to be upheld is my primary focus as I consider what it means to abolish the current systems and build generative, new, creative systems, that the humanity needs to be at the center.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the things that I hold, or that feels like such a tension that I feel in ministry and in this moment and in this work, is the tension between my desire for harm reduction, right? It is so important that in the current system there are people who are striving for the system to be something other than it currently is, and I think through their actions, whether they be in incarceration or in policing or wherever, right, who are trying to make it less bad, and how important that is, right? So the necessity of that, alongside, I think my conviction that reform is not the goal. That trying to make the existing bad system better, for me, that's not the goal. The goal is that we are building an entirely different, we are creating the thing we want instead of sort of band-aiding the thing we have. And while we are getting there, sometimes band-aiding the thing we have is necessary to improve people's lives. And that in that, how to point people towards imagination rather than fear, because it is so, everything about how policing and prisons is covered in the media just stokes a deep sense of fear rather than we can imagine a different solution together. And so that's, I think, what I'm holding. That's what I'm holding right now.